With there being so many main series Final Fantasy games now out in the wild, it's probably not too surprising that certain games within the franchise are considered to be overrated, while others are also considered to be underrated. Now, I'm no psychologist, but I feel as though when you're presented with a group of similarly themed products that have differing qualities, this is something that just happens naturally. After all, while we may enjoy the overarching theme, we all have different opinions about how that particular theme should be delivered. You can apply this line of thought to why you prefer one type of toothpaste to another, or why you buy a certain brand of toilet paper. There are many products that are grouped within these themes, but you will develop preferences. In this instance, we're obviously going to apply that principle to the numbered Final Fantasy titles, which are of course themed by not only the fact they share the same name and numbering convention, but also the fact they reside within the same genre. However, I'd say this particular grouping of games is also somewhat amplified, as each numbered title is essentially attempting to redefine what it means to be a product within that grouping with every new release. It's how we've gone from this to this to this in the past 20 and 30 years. Now, don't get me wrong, it's led to some powerful experiences over the years, and we've had the opportunity to experience the visions of different directors and creative teams, and as a result, there have been games that lean towards certain tastes more than others. If we look at Final Fantasy XV, for example, this is a game that caters more towards fans who prefer action-orientated gameplay, whereas Final Fantasy X catered more towards fans who prefer turn-based gameplay. What's important here though is the distinction that there is no right or wrong, there are just differences in opinion. If you are a fan who likes action-orientated combat, you aren't wrong for doing so, just as a fan who likes turn-based combat also isn't wrong for doing so. Now those examples are obviously two isolated factors that are used to form an opinion on whether a game is good or bad. There are many others though, such as opinions around the characters, the story, the music, the world, and so on and so forth. But what we're going to be looking at today is how these opinions ultimately permeate into the wider masses and transcend into opinions about whether games are viewed as overrated or underrated, and how these opinions can change over time. It's a topic that was recommended by one of our premium Patreon supporters, Sheena_th, and as a quick reminder, if you'd like to support us on Patreon, you can also suggest a topic for us to cover in the future. I'm actually rather glad that Sheena suggested we make a video about this, because from being part of the Final Fantasy community for such a long time, this is a particular topic I'm acutely aware of. To give a specific example, in the earlier days of the podcast, which for your reference was around 2008 to 2010, we were often quite critical of Final Fantasy XII and showed no real remorse for talking about it negatively on our show. We did this because it's just how we felt, and also because the majority of our fans who listened were in agreement with this assessment. But in the years that followed, our listeners started to become uncomfortable with our blanket statements and negative attitude towards Final Fantasy XII, and they started to call us out on it. Could we have gained a ton of new Final Fantasy XII fans during this time period? Potentially yes, but I always felt as though it was because there was a slow movement towards viewing Final Fantasy XII as a more positive entry into the franchise. Views were starting to soften over time, and the perception around the game was changing. We didn't change our opinions to suit this trend, but we did change how we discussed our opinions by providing more substance and rationale, something which our listeners appreciated. We were happier to do this too, as it presented a more well-rounded show, but to bring this back to the main topic, up until this point, I'd never really noticed opinions within the community start to change in such a manner towards particular games within the franchise. This has been happening for quite some time though. To start this analysis off, I'm going to ask you all a question. In terms of sheer literal volume, without any weighting applied of any kind, which main series Final Fantasy game do you think has been talked about by English speakers the most throughout 2017 in terms of being considered underrated? Not necessarily as being the most underrated, just that more people are talking about it in the context of being underrated. Have a think for a second. If you guessed Final Fantasy XV, then give yourself a pat on the back. Even though we don't have a full year's worth of data yet, excluding social media posts, which I'm sure are absolutely insane in terms of volume, throughout 2017 there have been approximately 9,300 different pieces of content written across websites on the internet that were related to the topic of Final Fantasy XV being underrated. When you think about it, that isn't all that surprising though. The game released within the past 12 months, and it's been a persistent entity throughout the year due to the release of free updates, DLC, and appearances at major trade shows. And as we've all seen online, there have been tons of debates happening about whether Final Fantasy XV was actually a good game or not. Many of them have become rather heated as, well, we're a passionate fan base, but it's also because Final Fantasy XV deviated so far from what was previously considered the norm in the franchise. It also introduced a lot of first-timers to the franchise who are looking to defend the game they've since fallen in love with. Would it therefore surprise you to learn that Final Fantasy XV has also been talked about the most in the context of being considered overrated? Hopefully not. And given the review scores and general sentiment, it also probably shouldn't surprise you to learn that the number of pieces of content in relation to being overrated are considerably less than the number talking about it being underrated, a ratio of around 6-1. This could be because people are more likely to defend something than go out of their way to trash it without provocation, but it could also be that people just don't actually think it's very good, so it therefore can't actually be considered overrated. Now, I feel as though these two factors are the baseline for the analysis: general popularity and general sentiment. And it's from these starting points that we can start to draw some conclusions around actual feelings and why they might change over time. For example, if we look at Final Fantasy II in the context of 2017 specifically, we can see that it appears last in terms of the number of people talking about it in the context of being underrated, but it appears 8th when we look at the number of people talking about it in the context of being overrated. It's not a very popular game, which would explain why it's low down on the list, but you therefore expect it to have a similar position in both lists, unless something else was entered into the equation. In this case, my feeling is that people just really don't like it, hence why it's disproportionately higher in the overrated list. People really want to hammer the point home that they don't like it, and they don't like anyone talking about the fact that they like it. But what other trends can we pick out if we look at similar data spanning all the way back to 2001? Apologies that I couldn't go back any further, but internet records start to get a little scarce, and even the numbers between 2001 and 2004 are a little sparse for my liking. I decided to include them though because there are still overall trends that can be witnessed, even if they might be a bit exaggerated. So, as mentioned, here we're looking at proportionally how many people were talking about each numbered Final Fantasy game as being underrated in any given year. The first thing you'll notice is that there are clear peaks for games in the years that surround their release. You can look at Final Fantasy X, 12, and 13 to see how this plays out, and I'd expect something similar to happen for Final Fantasy XV if we redid this graph in 2019 or 2020. In the year of their Western releases, there is often a surge of people coming out to defend new entries against criticism by saying it's an underrated title. In the case of Final Fantasy X, this was amplified by the release of Final Fantasy X Part 2 soon after, as it brought people's minds back to the original game, and due to Final Fantasy X-2's negative reception, I'd imagine people felt they needed to defend it even more to try and somehow remove the association. These peaks will then often decline over time with the game's popularity, something which is pretty clear across the majority of games featured here, but there are a few exceptions to this rule. The first would be Final Fantasy VII. If we look back at 2003, we can see a huge spike for this particular game, which correlates pretty well with the announcement of Advent Children and the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. A similar trend can also be seen in 2015 due to the announcement of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it's clear to me that these kinds of events, which are pretty monumental in the context of the franchise, but also the wider video games industry, they bring back old memories and help to ignite new discussions. Another interesting pair are both Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy XII, which despite their critical praise, are the two worst selling main series entries in the franchise after the release of Final Fantasy VII. These two games suggest more subtle shifts within the fanbase. If we look closely, for example, we can see that Final Fantasy IX starts to buck the decline as proportionally after 2004 there is an increase in people talking about it as being underrated. With Final Fantasy XII, there is a clear increase after 2013, which becomes even more pronounced if we normalize Final Fantasy VII to remove the Final Fantasy VII Remake effect that happened in 2015. And if we look at what was happening around this time, we can see that this does make sense. Square Enix indirectly sparked interest in Final Fantasy XII following the release of the Final Fantasy X 10-2 HD remaster, as it was the next in line to receive some kind of re-release. Yoshinori Kitase then expressed his interest in making this happen towards the end of 2013, and Final Fantasy XII started to creep back into the mainstream media. Square Enix employees were asked about it in interviews, and they encouraged fans to request it. People started making surveys, and more opinion pieces like this one from Game Informer and this one on NeoGAF started to appear. Now we're going to switch things up and look at it from the opposite perspective, and by doing so, we see somewhat similar trends. Here we're looking at how many people proportionally talked about a game in the context of it being overrated. In the case of Final Fantasy VII, people have often talked about it as being an overrated game within the franchise. It's also the most popular game after all, so it makes sense for it to have a target on its back. However, following the announcement of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, this was significantly amplified. It dwarfed similar sentiment around the newly released Final Fantasy X. This was no doubt fueled by those who didn't feel as though Final Fantasy VII needed to have its universe expanded because the original game was overrated. However, if we look at 2015, although there is a slight increase, the announcement of the Final Fantasy VII Remake didn't increase the frequency by anywhere near as much as we just saw when looking at it from the perspective of being underrated. And I feel as though part of this might be because they're going to be changing it as opposed to just re-releasing a spruced up version of the original. I feel as though people are therefore talking about the original in a more positive light as they don't want it to be changed and are remembering why they liked the original in the first place, potentially due to their fears that the remake will not deliver on their expectations. But what else can we pick out from this graph? Well, for one, we can see another occurrence that may be responsible for triggering a change in sentiment towards a game. If we look at Final Fantasy X again, we can see that there is a typical proportional decline over time when it comes to people referring to it as overrated. However, there's a small hike here in 2013 and a much larger hike in 2014, something which correlates perfectly with the release of the Final Fantasy X HD remaster right at the end of 2013. Final Fantasy XII suffers from a similar trend, as following the announcement and release of Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age, we've seen an increase in the proportional percentage of people talking about Final Fantasy XII as being overrated. In fact, in these past 2 years, it's the highest it's been since 2011, and if we remove Final Fantasy XV from the equation, this becomes even more pronounced in 2017. I feel as though this is caused in part by new audiences being introduced to these games and already having preconceived notions about how they should feel about them because people have been talking about them for so long in such a positive light. Alright, taking things one step further, we can create a mapping of just how people's proportional opinions differ by essentially combining the two graphs. And this makes things even more interesting, at least in my opinion. However, I must apologize because I realize that this graph looks like an absolute mess when you first look at it. What this essentially shows is proportionally how many people are talking about games in relation to each other. To give an example, in 2017, Final Fantasy XV contributed 39% of all underrated chatter, but only 29% of all overrated chatter, so it's therefore considered a positive ratio from the perspective of being underrated. However, in the same year, Final Fantasy II contributed only 1% of the underrated chatter, but 5% of the overrated chatter, so therefore the ratio is quite positive from an overrated perspective. By looking at the data in this way, you can very clearly see that shortly after the millennium, people felt that Final Fantasy IV was proportionally underrated. This coincides with the release of the game in Europe for the first time on the PlayStation and its re-release in North America, but that could just be coincidental. Final Fantasy III was also seen as a proportionally underrated game until the release of the remake in 2006. Final Fantasy V and VI, meanwhile, have remained quite static over the years as nothing has really happened for either of those games. But what's interesting about this graph is when we use it to isolate games like Final Fantasy X and XII in a binary fashion, and by doing so we can see the same trends that we mentioned earlier. Final Fantasy X was considered overrated following the release of Final Fantasy X Part 2, and has been again ever since the release of the Final Fantasy X HD remaster. Final Fantasy XII was considered a proportionally underrated title for a very long time. That was until the announcement and release of Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age. Looking at things in such a black and white fashion, we can also see that people proportionally feel as though Final Fantasy IX is overrated and potentially doesn't deserve the praise it gets from certain segments. And the same could be said about Final Fantasy VII, that is, until the announcement of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Final Fantasy IV, however, is pretty much the complete opposite. Aside from a few blips, it's been proportionally considered underrated since 2001. So yeah, that's my take on why, when, and how opinions changed towards the main series Final Fantasy games. I think it's pretty clear that big announcements, such as the Final Fantasy VII Remake, have a significant impact on how people feel about the original properties. Likewise, we can see that the releases of the remasters also quite significantly affect how people view the older games. And these are some of the main reasons why I feel opinions do change over time, as they help to serve as a catalyst for change, something that prompts either the defense or opposition of nostalgia. Either way, were you surprised by any of the insights I've pulled out while running through all the data? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. As mentioned, this video was suggested by Sheena_th, one of our premium Patreon supporters. And if you'd like to suggest a video topic for us to cover, then please head over to patreon.com/FFUnion to find out how you can do so. All supporters of our Patreon also get their names listed at the end of our videos, like these awesome folks right now. Alright guys, thank you for sticking with me until the end. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and the analysis. This is Daryl, signing out. I will see you all next time.